Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session and debate looking at power, climate and transformation, kindly organised by Coops Wales. Before we begin properly, a little bit of housekeeping. This session will be recorded, so if you don't want your face to appear on the Coops Wales YouTube channel, please do keep your camera off. And also, please do keep yourselves on mute when you can. That would be great. So today's going to be a bit of a Q&A with Anne Pettifor. But before I introduce Anne, a little bit about myself for those who don't know me. My name's Rebecca Harvey. I am the executive editor of Co-op News. Co-op News is a magazine and news website that's been going for over 150 years. It talks about cooperatives, social enterprises, very much in the terms of the international context. So we're not just UK based, though we are headquartered in Manchester. I'm delighted that we're joined by Anne Pettifor today, who will be speaking about the urgent need for a Green New Deal to tackle climate change and transform our power systems. And in particular, we'll be looking at, are there cooperative solutions to this? Anne is a political economist. She's an author and public speaker on global financial and economic systems, on money and monetary policy, and on the UK economy. In 2019, jointly co-authored the original Green New Deal, which was later taken up by AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US Congress. And in 2019, she authored the case for the Green New Deal. She's a director of policy research in macroeconomics. She chairs ADEUS, which is a community-based energy company in Edinburgh. And she's a long-standing fellow of the New Economics Foundation. She's also the former co-founder and director of Jubilee 2000, which is a global initiative to eliminate the debts of the world's poorest nations. And in 1998, this actually led to the G8 resolving to forgive $100 billion in third world debt across 37 countries. So, Anne, you wear a lot of hats, which is wonderful. You need a very big hat stand. But today I'm delighted to hand over to Anne to speak specifically about the case for the Green New Deal. There will be time at the end for questions, but actually we're going to have this more as a Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat or raise your hand. We can bring you in. It doesn't have to be a question. It can be a comment or a contribution as well. So hopefully this will be a really dynamic session. So, Anne, if it's okay, we're going to begin with a question from Cliff Mills, which he submitted. I know he sent some additional background information on it too. And Cliff said, my question for Anne is this. Why aren't we talking about cooperation in the context of addressing climate change?
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and it's wonderful to be with you all. And thank you all for giving up this time on your precious Saturday morning. It's a really good question that Cliff has posed, and I thought I would start with it from his angle. And I would look at this from both a micro point of view, which means from the point of view of what we're doing here on the ground, but also a more macro picture. And perhaps start with the macro picture. The fact of the matter is, to tackle climate breakdown, and it's no longer change, actually breaking down, we really need to cooperate at an international level. And because the climate doesn't know boundaries. And there is not enough work being done on that front. And I'm really sad about that, because actually we have lots of problems to solve that can only be solved through cooperation at a global level, at an international level. And the problem isn't just climate. The problem is also the nature of our financial system, of our global economic system. It is a system which actually, goes against the ability of us to work cooperatively to solve this problem. And that is because, we're now governed by markets, essentially. We now live in a world, and this is a point that Cliff makes in his longer note, we live in a world where markets make decisions, not governments. And governments have given away those powers. And very interestingly, just today in the Financial Times, there's an article by Anne Applebaum arguing that we should be doing something about the way in which money flows across the world, and in particular about tax havens, I like to call them crime havens, and about the way in which people hide and launder their money. Apparently, Donald Trump's big fancy block of flats in apartments in the middle of New York, he bought the whole building with a view to selling those buildings to shell companies, to people with no identity, who hide their identities, but with a lot of money. And it's very clear, says this article, that those sales were designed to launder money out of Russia, China, wherever there are oligarchs with too much that have stolen money that want to hide it. And he's been an active, and there's been no jail term for him for doing that, because we allow money to flow freely across borders, and we allow tax havens to exist. And Applebaum says, why don't we just simply ban that? Why don't we simply ban tax havens? Why don't we simply legislate to say it's illegal to own a property in central London without showing who the real beneficiary owner of that property is? Why is that happening? Why is it possible to set up a company in London and call it Donald Duck and have your fellow directors as Mickey Mouse? Because that's what happens. People take it. So the question is, so long as we have an economic system where money can flow freely across borders and the wealthy can avoid taxation, so long will it be difficult for governments to mobilize the finance they need in order to finance this very great transformation that we have to undertake. This is like facing war with your hands tied behind your back as a government. We've actually, London, let's face it, London is a tax haven. And but in order to change that system, we're going to have to work cooperatively. We're going to have to, you can't do it in isolation. Britain alone can't ban tax havens. We can't alone ban, the laundering of money. That has to be done in cooperation with other countries. And we need leadership for that to happen. So I'm taking the liberty of Cliff's point to say that there is a bigger global macroeconomic issue here. It's going to be very difficult for governments to work cooperatively to tackle the climate, so long as we don't work cooperatively to tackle the way the financial system operates. So that's at that level. Then at the micro level, I don't really mean micro, I mean at the domestic level, the way our economy has evolved is it's evolved to make markets, as Cliff says, the driving force. But underlying those markets is a thing that's absolutely fundamental to the operation of markets, and it's called an asset. Now, assets are property. Your property can be an asset. It's an asset because it generates income ultimately. When you sell it, you probably get more for it. If you rent it out, you get rent and so on. But asset can be a government bond. It can be a work of art. It can be a vintage car. These are all assets which, if you are rich enough to own one, you can flog it off or rent it out and make a lot more money effortlessly. And we've lived through an era of what's known as asset price inflation. What's so extraordinary about that era is that central banks go crazy if they see even the tiniest hint of consumer price inflation, but they completely ignore, and in fact they have actively inflated asset price inflation, right? Now the question, and I'm coming to Cliff's point, believe it or not, the question is, who owns assets? Well, the top 1% own assets. They own stocks and shares, they own bonds, they own yachts, they own private jets, all of which are assets which could generate rent. But so do the top 10%, and I include myself in that, those of us who own properties. The problem with that system is that the whole economic system is geared towards the interests of people like me, and more importantly, to the interests of the 1%, mainly because they have a lot more money than I do and a lot more valuable assets than I do. The 90%, or there may not be 90%, but the majority that don't own assets, that live in rented accommodation or that live in social housing or that don't live in any kind of housing, probably live with their parents. Those are the people that are cut out from our economy and the interests of our economy and the way our economy operates. So we have to change that. And this is where Cliff's point really comes into play here, because we need a system where those who do not own assets actually can cooperate to change, to achieve stability in their lives, to achieve fulfillment in their lives. Now, I happen to be, I think I'm on the board of, but I'm certainly very active in something called the social guarantee. And the social guarantee is a campaign at the moment for something that you would recognize perhaps more easily as universal basic services. And I'm going to be at the Labour Party conference talking about this, actually. And the thing about universal basic services is that they don't exist. They don't exist to operate through, or they should not exist to operate through the market. And they include health, they include education, they include many things we take for granted, social care. They include care for the children as well as for adults and so on. But they also include public transport. They include, or you could think of public laundries as a part of universal basic services. And the whole idea is that to build up that base of public services, which for those who do not have assets, who are not part of the asset economy, can actually cooperate and work together to solve all their biggest problems: how to get to work, public transport, how to keep warm in winter through a publicly owned energy system, how to have a roof over your head through public social housing, and so on. Now, in this current climate, that idea is regarded as incredibly radical. I mean, even having a public health service today, it seems to me, even with the new Labour government, is regarded as radical, because increasingly people are talking about privatizing these assets, about privatizing these services. And I want us to go in the opposite direction. So to answer Cliff's question, we need to change, we need to transform our economy altogether, and we need to build what we call universal basic services, those services which we all need and can't live without, no matter who we are, rich or poor. Now, that's quite difficult. And perhaps, Rebecca, I could just wind up this answer to Cliff's question by speaking a little bit about my role as a commissioner on the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission. So we're looking at how Scotland can make this transition to a more sustainable economy. And it's extraordinarily difficult for Scotland because she has so much oil offshore, and so much wealth in Scotland derives from that oil and gas. We've just been to the Isle of Shetland, where they have an incredible oil and gas industry, and their harbour is a modern harbour to deal with really the latest technology used in oil and gas. They have wind farms and they have tidal wave energy. So Scotland has got all that, and we're having to talk about, well, how does Scotland transition? And I'm arguing we have to restructure the economy. We have to restructure the way we think about the economy. We have investment, and Cliff's point is we're always talking about investment in. We think about investment in physical infrastructure. How do we build another bridge? How do we fix the roads? How would you build a railway, North-South Railway, and so on? And how do we find the investment for that? I'm arguing that we need to think now increasingly about building social infrastructure, because what we need to survive climate breakdown is social resilience, right? We need people to be able to cope with floods and storms, with their houses being washed away, with their farmers' fields being washed away and the harvests being destroyed. We need ways in which to cope for that, and that requires social infrastructure. And the great thing about social infrastructure on the whole is that it is not carbon emitting. Of course, there's carbon involved, but on the whole, these are activities that we take without burning oil. And they include education, for example. And I don't just mean schools for kids or little nursery classes for little babes. I mean universities. I mean adult education. I mean all of the skills and a lot of those skills can involve, for example, the arts. We've got to move to a point where the arts become something valuable, not just a building, but the ability to sing, the ability to play instruments, music. Music is part of our social infrastructure. Music is part of what makes us resilient and able to cope. The same applies to art and so on. And then there's science. Science is a part of our social infrastructure. Now, I'm telling you this because when I raise these questions with the chaps who work on oil rigs off Scotland's coast and are earning, I don't know, £30,000 a year as an oil rig engineer, when I say to them, look, you're going to have to come on shore and you've got to learn about social infrastructure, they're horrified. They say, oh, my God, you mean I've got to go into an old person's care home and deal with people with Alzheimer's and be paid £12,000 a year or maybe £20,000 a year? And I say, yeah. But actually what I think is that to look after someone with Alzheimer's requires as much, if not more, skills than you have. And so I would like to see you upskilled to do that job. And I'd like to see you paid a lot more for it because it's such a valuable job. But those are the arguments we're having to have about how we move this economy into something quite different.
And I'm just going to, can I jump in now, Anne? So I'm going to jump in if that's all right, because we've got a lot of questions coming in and I've got about 1 million questions of my own to ask. So I'm going to put 3 points to you, then hopefully we'll be able to carry on this conversation in this context. I was fascinating what you said right at the beginning about the need to work cooperatively. But I think there is a difference between working cooperatively, cooperating the verb, and working through cooperatives, the organisational structure, the noun.
Right.
So it'd be really interesting to see or hear your thoughts on that type of ownership. As you said, governments have given away their powers. Where are these powers going to go? Can they go actually into the people who use the economy more, into cooperatives? So that's one question. And I guess it'd be interesting to talk maybe about credit unions within that social structure as well. So that's one element. And then there's an interesting question from Alex Bird I'd like to bring in as well. He says, the USA tax system forces citizens to pay US tax on all their income wherever they make it. They get a credit on foreign tax already paid, but to keep their passport, they have to pay the US inland revenue the balance at US rates. Is that worth trying? So that's the second question. And the third one is actually from Cliff himself, who said, with respect, I think that Anne's answer is focused on how to change things at a systemic level from the top down. The Rochdale Pioneer started at the bottom, and the retail movement came into existence without government help, without asset owners making this happen, just ordinary people from the 90%. Why would a Labour government not want to support that? So I guess there's two focuses here about ownership and who's making this change, and then this question from Alex about is this US tax system process worth considering in the UK?
Right. Well, let's go straight to the cooperative question. And I'm sorry if I've taken the concept too loosely, but I think international coordination and cooperation is absolutely essential to climate.
I completely agree. Absolutely.
Right. So the point is this, that then the question of ownership and bottom up comes in, and I think we need to have both. I don't really think it's possible. And yes, the Rochdale Pioneers are an inspiration. And yes, they did just get together and do it. And yes, let's just do that. Let's set up in our own towns universal basic services. How are we going to do that? We're going to need, a problem is we're going to need property. We're going to need, if we want to set up a swimming pool or a laundry or whatever it is, you're going to need land for it. And at the moment, the price of land and the price of property is determined entirely by the market. And we know that we've been trying to find around here places for that kind of activity to be rented by ordinary members, voluntarily forming community groups to help food banks or to help with the garden, growing vegetables and that sort of thing. It's extraordinarily difficult within the current system and within the current climate. But there's no questioning the facts. So the question of property and ownership is the question of how do we deal with the market, because it's a wonderful thing to think of. We could own I was at a cooperative conference when we talked about owning our own taxi ranks, for example, and competing with Uber. And I don't know where that has got to. I just think it would be extraordinarily difficult to do. And that brings me to your question about credit unions, because actually you need to raise the finance to keep it going. You need to be able to build the software to get all the taxi drivers to agree to operate in that way. And you need to invest in fact, to set it up. And I don't know that was possible, because I haven't seen any evidence of a cooperative taxi system yet, although there are definitely alternatives. But I suppose what I'm saying is that, yes, I think ownership matters, but the question becomes, how do we, I think the Rochdale pioneers, how did they find a property from which to base themselves, to set up their first shop? I've watched our local cooperative chemist be taken over by a big global company. I've watched our own cooperative not operating here. There is a co-op not far from here, Leyston, which is very successful. But it's been established for a very, very long time to begin again. I think I'm waffling here, because I'm trying to say that actually within our current market system, it's very, very difficult to think about ownership. But I'm more than willing to see a government change the laws, and a government to set it up in such a way that there's preferential treatment, perhaps preferential tax treatment for people wanting to cooperate, to coordinate together, to set up and own institutions which can be used to provide services to the economy. And then I think the second question, Rebecca, was to do with the American tax system. Yes, absolutely. The IRS chases Americans around the world, but our wealthy oligarchs don't use their American passport to move their money around. They buy a passport from an island in Bermuda or somewhere else in the Pacific, pay a lot of money for that citizenship, and use that passport. So don't worry that, the IRS is probably the most effective tracker of people avoiding taxes in the world, but they still can't compete with a system which allows the free flow of capital in that way.
That's absolutely fascinating. Sorry, too many tabs open, Googling lots of different things as you're talking. It's really, really interesting. I think what you're saying about property is really, really pertinent. And I'm going to bring Cliff in, because I know he wants to expand on this a little bit. And I think one of the problems is scale. I mean, in the next issue of Co-op News, we're doing a feature on Middleton cooperating. And that set out because what they wanted to do was take over Warwick Mill, which looms over Middleton. But actually they can't, because it's owned by a Chinese conglomerate who's been sitting on it for 10 years and hasn't done anything and can't access that. So I think, do you think one of the problems is scale, Cliff? Can I bring you up on this, please? Don't forget to take yourself off mute.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and good morning, Anne, and thanks for your engagement in this and participation. It's really great to have you. Yes, I mean all the problems you mentioned. How if you want to start something, how do you get hold of the asset? How do you get hold of the property? How do you get hold of money, working capital to establish? That's the work that those of us involved in what we call cooperative development are doing all the time. We are trying to help groups in communities who generally themselves don't have access to large amounts of money. And we help them with grant funding, or we help them with the small amount that they have got to build up a business, to develop reserves and develop a business plan and expand. And that's basically what the cooperative development movement does. Mm-hmm. But it does it almost in spite of government. It's not looking for philanthropists, because that's a different model. Cooperation is self-help. It's about people doing themselves, and it's all earning income. Mm-hmm. But what government, or what the UK government seems to fail to understand, that is not only a legitimate and realistic way of providing goods and services, but it should be supporting and allowing and facilitating it by changing the laws to encourage it.
Yeah.
Because what the Rochdale Pioneers did with the £28 they saved up from their own money to start it off, what they were doing was to create a way of doing business outside the market.
Mm-hmm.
It was an alternative to the market. And the thing that I think is being missed in the big picture is that cooperation is an alternative to the market, because the participants get together and say, rather than the market rules applying, which we know are harsh and cruel and, extractive, we are going to set up our own rules, which we call cooperative values and principles, and we're going to operate on that basis. And the cooperative movement worldwide is worth trillions, and there are billions of people involved in it. It does work. It is working. But in those economies like ours, which are so mesmerized by neoliberal thinking, it's as if they can't see that citizen-based enterprise is possible. And in those countries like, for example, Italy, where they recognize cooperatives in their national constitution, they are then able to, they recognize them that are not profit generating, state run, and they do give them tax breaks. And the reason the Italian economy is the cooperative economy is so much better developed is because of the tax breaks. That's all the government needs to do, actually.
Right, I'm going to bring you in here, Cliff, because we do have a lot of other questions. So, Anne, do you want to come back on that?
No, just to say I agree with Cliff. And it is just that point I was trying to make, which is that you need the government to provide tax breaks to give incentives and advantages to cooperative working. Yeah. Okay.
Excellent. Right. There's a comment here from Gillian, which... there's a really good comment here from Gillian, who says, he brings in the Rochdale Pioneers again. She says, the Rochdale Pioneers also followed the Dr. William King advice: start small and gradually build up, using the profits to do something else until you finally change the world. And I think that your comment on taxes I garnered a lot of response in the comments. And I know there are a few taxi co-ops around, so my puts a link into a successful cooperative alternative to Uber in New York, which is now expanding to Denver. And I know that Alex Bird wanted to come in on this. So Alex, the floor is yours. Don't forget to take yourself off mute.
No, I've just done that. Yes, taxi co-ops have had a lot of difficulties. I'm picking up on Cliff's point about how the Rochdale Pioneers just chipped in their own money. It is more difficult for worker co-ops in general, and taxi co-ops are essentially worker co-ops, because you have a small number of people trying to raise a large amount of money. And a number of taxi co-ops have struggled over the years, and certainly we had a large taxi co-op in Cardiff, and it failed at one of the technical points. You had the technical points when radio networks came in, and then you had GPS tracking and all that. And they have found it difficult. The two that have survived are the two largest taxi operators in Edinburgh. And essentially, if you get into a black cab in Edinburgh, certainly in a cooperative taxi. So there are examples of ones that have survived.
Good. Thank you for that. Yes, well, I'm glad to hear that, because it was some years ago that I was at an annual conference where it was raised, and I thought, because I hate Uber and I hate the way it's taken over taxis, or almost taken over in London. Yeah.
Chris, you have your hand up. Are you talking about taxis or something else?
I'm talking about something else, if I may. There are questions in the chat, and I'll put them nice and succinctly to Anne, if I may. Absolutely, go for it. Right, and three angles. One is COP 26, 27, 28, and I suspect 29, etc. IMF, does it just uphold capitalism effectively, and therefore do we have nil faith in capitalist institutions? And then finally, so one is looking at COP, one is looking at IMF, and then finally, me and man in the street, what can we do other than voting Labour in the general election, which doesn't exactly satisfy me? What can I do? Thank you.
Wow, those are big questions. Perhaps starting with the last one, and this pertains very much to the work you're all doing, which is political organisation. we have been encouraged by the market system to fragment and to, move into our individualist lifestyles where we don't know enough about, and yet we all instinctively want to work cooperatively. And I was very struck by this during the pandemic when we had lockdowns, because remarkably in my neck of the woods, which is very, very conservative, a great deal of cooperation and coordination took place, even while we were distancing and so on. And people instinctively want to do it and can do it, So, but the problem with it was that it wasn't political. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about who has the power and how to take the power from them. And so I think that's really the question. Now, we have a Labour government with a massive majority. They have power, but are they going to use that power, for example, to make cooperative ownership and cooperative activity more sustainable? And I somehow think they won't, really. It seems from every indication they're giving that they are reluctant to shift too much too quickly. Now, I understand that's politics and so on and so forth. But the question is, what are we doing about all that power that is now based on the Labour Party's representation in Parliament? And we're doing that here in Suffolk because we have a very big problem with the national grid here. But we know that our Labour candidate, our Labour MP, has a wafer-thin majority. And therefore, we have more power relative to her than we had when we had a Conservative MP with 23,000 majority to raise coffee. So we are more powerful now. The question is, can we organise? So for me, it comes back to organisation, and organisation that, and this is partly what I worry about with the bottom-up approach, is that sometimes it feels as though it's isolationist. We can't have a bottom-up approach unless we're also tackling power. And my talk was going to be about that precisely. And we can't tackle power until we organise politically. And how we organise politically is the question. So I'm very long in the tooth, and I go way back with the Labour Party. And when we began, I began with the Labour Women's Action Committee. There were very few. In the 1979 election, there were fewer women MPs elected than they had been in definitely 1945, but even, I think, in the pre-war period. And we organised. It was nasty. It was dirty. It was mean sometimes. It was fun other times. And the women got together. Our problem was, first of all, that we were divided. There were women who said, don't rock the boat. We're here to support the Labour government and the Labour Party, and we can't criticise them because there's not enough women or black people. And we said, to hell with that. We're going to organise. It took us years. It took years of my life because I thought it was so important to have more women in Parliament. But what it taught me was that actually people from below with no power, we women had virtually, A, we're poorer, we were a lot poorer now. B, we didn't have positions of influence. And women who did have influence didn't want us to rock the boat, didn't want us to storm the platform at the Labour Party conference and so on and so forth. So we had to tackle power in every which way we could. And so part of me worries about the bottom-up approach, which doesn't take power into account. So I feel I'm rambling again here, Rebecca, but I think I just wanted to make that point. But Chris, what were your other questions? Oh, the IMF was one question, wasn't it?
And COP.
The IMF is a leftover of the 1945 Bretton Woods system. And it's a distortion of what was wanted at Bretton Woods. The Americans wanted to have control over it, as they wanted to have control of the world's currency, the reserve currency, the US dollar. And as such, it acts as gatekeeper, and it acts as gatekeeper not just for governments, but in particular for Wall Street. In other words, you can invest in Chile because Chile is doing they're cutting back on their public health system and they're privatizing. Yeah, no, they're a good thing to invest in here. Put your money here. Don't put your money into this country who's trying to do something different. So they play that role, but increasingly their role in the global economy has become marginal. The real governance of the world system isn't through the IMF and the World Bank, but through Wall Street, essentially. So, but that's a very big story.
And this, can I just jump in here? Because this brings actually Martin Meatyard's latest comment to the fore, actually. He says, how can we set about creating an alternative financial system that can properly mobilise the resources of those committed to social transformation? So how can we make this change, Anne?
Right. Well, that's the big question, and that's the bottom-up, top-down question too. So first of all, I think the very first thing we have to do, and I learnt this from the Jubilee 2000, the work I did on Jubilee 2000, the very first thing is to organise and to be clear about our demands. And then the second, really most important thing is to unite. What we did around Jubilee 2000 was to say there's a problem. The creditors run the world. Poor countries that are debtors have no power. What are we going to do about it? Well, where is the power? Well, the power rests not inside the technocratic IMF, but on the board of the IMF, where all the finance ministers sit. That's where the power lies. Let's go after the finance ministers. And so we began to, and secondly, we can't do this from Britain alone. We can't just say, look, we think this is bad and we want to campaign on this. We had to work with Africa, with Latin America, with the Europeans, and we did. Thank God for the internet. We began our campaign as the internet took off. And so we coordinated internationally, cooperated internationally, and challenged Tony Blair, President Clinton, and we got $100 billion of debt cancelled. So it is a bottom-up process, and I'm very much in favour of those. But again, we had to understand that in power terms. Now, we weren't a political party. We were a movement, and a social movement is a very different thing. But what we did was we located power in the first instance, and then we did everything we could to influence that power. And we would have to do it here at home, for example. We spent a lot of time here working with the debt management office, which was responsible for piling all this debt onto poor countries and providing subsidies to big business with our government and so on. And then we would work, of course, the Americans were the most important, and they were the most difficult to get involved from a bottom-up point of view. But we worked with the Europeans, with the Africans, the NGO, civil society, blah, blah. So it's about organising, essentially, and about tackling power, which is the question that I've been posing already in this talk. So, does that answer your question, or that question, Martin?
I think it does for now, but we will bring another question in from Martin shortly. I am enjoying in the chat John Boyle flying the flag for the Co-op Party, Labour and Cooperative. We have 43 Co-op MPs, 1,600 councillors, 5 Metro mayors and 16 Welsh Senate members.
You have a lot of power.
You have a lot of power, John. Use it wisely. Yeah. I'm going to bring us back slightly, if it's okay, to climate and the environment, because that was the original title of this, and I'm really enjoying how expansive this conversation has become. But we do have a couple of questions around this, and then I know there are some questions around Wales, so we'll come to Wales shortly in particular. But first of all, the climate. And I really enjoyed what you said at the start. Well, I didn't enjoy, but I recognise exactly what you said about the climate doesn't know boundaries. I thought that was a really powerful statement. And the fact that we need to cooperate at an international level. And of course, next year, the UN has declared 2025 as the second international year of cooperatives. So hopefully cooperatives can cooperate with governments and make some changes in this area too. But on climate, the environment, industrialisation, a couple of questions. Firstly, from early question from Chris, actually. He said, do we have to accept an equalisation between the southern hemisphere and the industrialised north hemisphere? This will make us poorer, and thus some people will resist it. So that's quite an interesting comment. Chris also asked about what faith you have in a series of annual meetings on climate, the COP28, COP29, etc. And then Pam asked, she said, because of a lack of national leadership on people solutions, a collaboration of grassroots food groups are calling for the repurposing of a huge public asset in their neighbourhoods, our public realm paid for by our taxes, on public land. I know Pam comes from Incredible Edible, so that's quite an interesting point as well. So 3 points there about equalisation in terms of industrial north and south, the climate COP meetings, and then growing on public land.
Right. So on the whole north-south question, the real problem is this: the inequality and the inequity in the way in which we're tackling climate breakdown. The fact of the matter is that the bulk of the emissions come from the north, but even more importantly, the bulk of the emissions come from the top 10% and in particular the top 1%. And for me, the problem with, again, the bottom-up approach, and I love the work being done by Just Stop Oil and Extinction Represent and so on, but what happened right at the start of the movement around climate change was that BP issued this story about footprints. And what that story tells you is that you, every single one of us, is responsible for this crisis, and we all have to change, right? And that is dishonest, really, because the bulk of the emissions comes from the north, and the bulk of the emissions come from the top 1%. Now, recently there was the drama of the yacht that sank in the Mediterranean. I found that such a powerful analogy because, number one, super yachts emit far more than even super private jets do, right? Trillions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Because not only does the yacht get used by the billionaire once or twice a year or in the summer or whatever, it has to be maintained for every day of the year, and it has staffing on it and so on. And what happened in Italy that night was that there was an extreme event. And what's happening now is that everybody's blaming the captain. But the weather event was extraordinary. It was a little typhoon that seemed to just home in on this yacht. The yacht had a very thing. So it was unstable. It was more likely to be a typhoon than the yachts around it. But the fact of the matter is, the real cause of that crisis, climate breakdown, and the extreme weather events that we see more and more of. What was amazing was the attention paid to the International and big companies like Hiscox and so on. And of course, the owner of the boat was a high-tech guy, Mike Lynch. Every year, asylum seekers drown in the Mediterranean. Almost every day of the year, well, maybe not every day, but once a week, people drown in the North Sea. And we just don't cover it in our media. 7 people drown in an extreme event in Italy, and it went on for days, the coverage, the concern, the worries, the sadness. And it was a tragedy, no question about it. But for me, what that illustrated so clearly was the inequity and the inequality in this whole discussion. And so from a political point of view, from a point of view of the movement, it seems to me absolutely essential that we shouldn't just say, oh, everybody is responsible for this crisis, because everybody is not responsible for this, even within Europe. There's a Professor Kevin Anderson, he's the advisor to Greta Thunberg at Manchester University. You'll know him. And he has argued that the 1% cut their emissions to just the same level as 50% of all Europeans, we would cut a third of all emissions overnight, right? So what I feel is that the way to approach the issue is to blame us all, and that makes us impotent. And it means how do I change my lifestyle? You know, how do I insulate my house by myself? I just can't do it on my own. So you then paralyze the movement into, sorry, but we know who's really responsible for this. Let's go after them until they change their habits, until they stop flying by private jets, and until they stop using big yachts. Then, only then, can we ask others to make sacrifices. And part of the reaction against the movements on climate is the feeling of ordinary people. For example, you know, a small baker in the south of France who needs a little white van to take his bread, to deliver his bread to villagers, clobbered with a massive tax by President Macron, when he feels that, look, I'm just trying to earn a living here, and I haven't done very much. but the owner of the yacht gets taxed, always probably avoiding tax, right? And so on and so forth. So I think the movement has to change the focus here and go after the real bad guys. And they include people like me. They include the top 10%. We are more responsible than the 90%. And, we are the ones that have to change our lifestyles. We in the North have got to change our lifestyles. And I think until we do that, we're not going to mobilize the degree of public support that we need for climate breakdown. And I've already lost track of the next question.
No, it leads on quite nicely, actually, Anne. So what role does the COP meetings have to play in all of this?
Yeah, so the UN is playing this very positive role of providing us with information and bringing everybody around a table. It cannot, and it's hamstrung to act politically, really. That has to be done by the movement. And the movement has done an enormous amount already to raise awareness against the most extraordinary from the fossil sector, basically, not just here, but most notably in the United States, where an oil man in the Democrats in the Senate managed by legislation. So, this has been a big fight, and even so, the issue has been pushed to the top of the agenda. The BBC now does have to write about this stuff. So we've done an enormous amount, but we've now got to, in my view, hone the tactics and the strategy and to get much more quicker results and more radical results than we've got so far. And the UN isn't the body to do that. The UN is a community, if you like, of governments. It's not one. It can't actually change the direction of those governments.
Alex in the chat has just confirmed that the yacht was owned by Mike Lynch's wife via an Isle of Man company. Of course, the Isle of Man is a tax haven or crime, as Anne would put it.
There you go. Thank you very much for that, Mike. So I hadn't picked that up.
Bring it down more to the micro level, back to Pam's question about what your view to the right to grow on public land.
Right. So, I think it's a wonderful idea. I belong here to a small community garden, and we have been battling with the county council who want to develop the space that we're in for housing, for private housing, with a touch of social housing on the side. And we are battling to hold on to that piece of land to grow food, which is what we're doing. We're doing it for our local community and so on and so forth. It's absolutely a fundamental right that we should demand of a government, and especially if the land is left fallow and not being used. So all power to your elbow on that one.
Incredible, do fantastic things. So good luck with that, Pam. I hope it continues. Right. This event is being organised by Coops Wales, and we have a few questions about Wales in particular. Alex Bird says, in Wales we're working to establish a regional and national mutual bank, Bank Cambria. It's a long process, but we're getting near to crunch point, working with partners and support from Welsh Government. So, first of all, Anne, what are your views on community banks like this?
Well, it's a bit like credit unions. I first of all want to congratulate you if you've got this far. But I also want to say that managing a bank is one of the most challenging and difficult things you could possibly do, really. And a credit union. You're managing time periods, essentially. You're managing taking money in short term and giving it out long term sometimes. I think managing, I think that's why I think banks should be public institutions, because difficult to manage and very difficult to manage profitably, which is why our banks effectively are backed up by the state massively. I think it's a wonderful idea. The problem is, are you going to be offering very low rates of interest? What is? And I would hope that you would do, because I have a moral question, a moral issue when it comes to 2,000 years of usurious debate about usury and about how unjust and immoral usury is. And it's a debate that's been, 2000 was about the Christian belief in periodic cancellation of debts. So the question is, if you are going to, and I hope you do, offer low rates of interest, because low rates of interest enable the borrower to invest and to do something and to grow a return. If that return is not high enough to repay the debt very quickly, and that if the interest rate is high, then the rate of return on that interest has to be higher in order to give the borrower a living wage, but also the level of extraction to maintain that rate of return gets higher. So for me, there's a direct link between very high real rates of interest in our economy and real rates of extraction. We have to strip the forest of Brazil to repay Brazil's debts. We have to fish the seas in order to repay borrowed money by private equity firms and so on. So there is a direct correlation between very high rates of interest and extraction, both of human labor, but also of the assets. But if you charge very low rates of interest, you will not attract capital into your bank. And so there's this very difficult dilemma. It's one of the reasons why I think rates of interest should, if you like, be nationalised, and the government and the Bank of England should be managing rates of interest across the spectrum of short or long-term loans or safe and risky loans and in terms of inflation, in order to manage rates across the economy to very low levels. This is one of John Maynard Keynes' most brilliant interventions, was his liquidity preference theory, which led to low rates across the spectrum of lending.
Elliot, could you turn it down a tiny bit, please?
I welcome the establishment of a mutual bank, but I just would like to argue that it's very, very challenging, and I wish you all the strength to your elbows to make it work.
I know Cliff has also mentioned that Avon Mutual is also in the process of application for a banking licence and a cooperative bank. And I do, because as I said earlier, Co-op News works internationally, and it's fascinating to see just how small credit unions and community banks are in terms of the UK economic landscape compared to internationally. Like, I know it's a much bigger country, but last week we covered the Brazilian Credit Cooperative Congress. They had people turn up. You know, it's absolutely huge. It's just a very, very different way of engaging in economics.
And do you know, Rebecca, whether or not the government gives them incentives and regulations that support their work? Or
I couldn't tell you offhand, Rebecca. Find that out though, and I will let you know. It is a fascinating structure though.
And as you said earlier, Italy too. I mean, that's where the slow food movement began, largely because of that. Excuse me.
Let's bring it back to Wales once more. Dan Roberts from Compass says it would be great to hear from Anne what innovative ideas could be taken forward at the Welsh level. We are in a decades-long process of developing the Welsh Government and the powers it has available to it. So what can we do to embed co-op principles throughout? What would be a sign that Wales was on track to become the next great cooperative nation? And actually, this ties in with something that David Smith says as well. Said in the context of the UK budget statement, what advice would Anne offer to the Chancellor? So I guess, what advice, Anne, would you also offer to Welsh Government?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a wet blanket here, but and I'm repeating myself, but Wales does not exist in isolation and cannot exist in isolation. Wales is integrated into the global economy. We know that from the steel industry. You know, it's owned by an Indian company. And for that reason, and that's happened because of mobility, because the Indian capitalist is able to invest in Wales and get his money across borders without any friction. When Indians come to England to work, there's a great deal of friction. There's a great deal of hassle for them to get across the border. If you want to trade Indian pharmaceuticals, there's a great deal of friction at the border, but not money. And Wales is, and I'm sorry if this sounds grim, but Wales is part of a much bigger picture. And the question is, how can we, within that framework, do things which are particularly Welsh? come back to the idea that, yes, of course it's bottom up, of course it's building movements, of course it's making demands. But above all, and at the moment I'm trying to write a book about the international system and how it governs everything that we do, is to spread awareness and understanding. Most people don't know how the system works. And actually, it's not rocket science to understand it. But until you understand it, you don't know why you're angry. You don't know what you're trying to change. You don't know what you're trying to do. And let me give you an example. As part of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission, we went to the Isle of Lewis, this isolated island, the Western Isles, and we went to a community-owned wind farm. It was wonderful. The story was amazing. They raised £15 million. No British bank would lend them money. They had to go to Spain. They raised £15 million. They built a road to carry the huge truck for the huge turbine, which they then installed in their village. And they would generate, in the year we were there, which was 23, was it 23 or 22 now? That the oil price was going through the roof. The energy prices were going through the roof. They made a fortune. And they were distributing this around the community. So that was all wonderful. Downtown to Stornoway that night for a town hall meeting. And businessmen and women came up to us and said, it's all very well having this fancy gear at the bottom of my garden, this huge turbine. But I pay a price for energy which is going to wipe out my business this year. You know, there was one woman who ran a wool business, and she said, I do all my trade in the summer with tourists. My winter bill is going to mean I have to close down my business for sure. You know, they don't pay the price of that energy on their doorstep. They pay the global price of energy. And the global price of energy is not fixed in Wales or on the Isle of Lewis or in Britain. It's fixed in Chicago, in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, where commodities are traded, right? And Mr. Putin doesn't fix the price, nor does the Saudi prince. The price is fixed by at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And Wales is as much a victim of that system as are the people of the Isle of Lewis. And so I come back to, I'm sorry about the big picture. I'm sorry if it sounds too big and you want to get down to brass knobs here, you know, on the ground and, you know, bottom up work. But in that context, it's not going to be possible. So I want us to spread greater understanding of how we've given away the governance of communities, of our regions, of our nation to global markets. And we all love it because it means we can travel, we can go on exotic holidays. It means we can buy from Amazon anything we fancy. It means, do you know what I mean? We are partly responsible for it. So we can't complain too much because we do very well out of it. And we prop it up. But it's the thing that's making it very difficult, Wales, if you like, to be self-reliant, to build the kind of institutions and communities it would like to build. That's not to say it's not possible. And, you know, the whole point about this discussion is that we should all be getting organized for that, to change that. But we have to begin with understanding. We have to understand that our government doesn't fix the price of energy. And the price of energy is going to hurt the people of Wales in this coming winter, almost more than a form of economic activity. So I'm sorry about that.
So Mike Bird says that actually the most positive work we can do in Wales is to seek better understanding of how the economy really works, as Anne says. And it's fascinating what you're saying about frameworks, Anne, because one thing that is happening in the UK, of course, is the Law Commission review of UK cooperative law, which will obviously hopefully make it easier to set up cooperatives. You've been speaking for an hour, Anne, so I'm just going to bring in Cliff Mills just to talk a little bit about this, give your voice a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back with some more questions if that's okay. So Cliff, could you talk to us a little bit about the Law Commission review, where it's up to, what's happening next, and then see where we go from there?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Yes, so Anne, company law gets continually revised. It's completely rewritten every generation or so, and most recently in 2006. cooperative law, largely because it's such a tiny part of the economy and can't justify the legislative time, has never had a proper review before since it started in 1844. But as the result of a deal done last summer in the context of a private member's bill, the government agreed that there should be a law. The previous government agreed there should be a law commission review of co-op law. And the commission review is an apolitical process, and there's a consultation paper to be launched in mid-September. There's a real chance to do some quite significant changes to co-op law to enable us to do some of the things like have cooperatives that trade outside market conditions, which could then be supported by tax or suitable tax arrangements. I guess the question is, would you, Anne, be willing to add your voice? Could we work with you in the context of review? Because as the co-op movement, we can command quite a lot of support from the cooperative movement, but it would be a slightly cheeky request, but whether you would be willing to talk to us and potentially add your voice to the calls for reform here.
I'd be delighted to, and I'm a little bit overwhelmed by work at the moment, but if we can fit that in principle, absolutely yes.
Thank you.
I'm not a lawyer.
It's you as the economist that we want.
Right.
And to answer Rebecca's question, there'll be a I think it's a 12 or a 16-week consultation period, followed by which the commission will then have meetings with people, and they will then come out with their recommendations.
Oh.
And those recommendations might be implemented by government, but of course, with a Labour government, we're hopeful that they would give them some parliamentary time.
Oh.
But that's the process.
Yeah, right. No. If I can help on that, I would be delighted to.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so many questions coming in. Let's go to education and understanding, because I think, especially in the co-op movement, one of the biggest problems we have is co-op is, or they think we're the supermarket with the blue branding. Yeah. So David Smith actually asks around awareness, what changes would you wish in terms of education system to support a greater understanding, I guess, both of cooperatives and the dynamics you described in terms of supporting active citizenship, both from primary to business schools level? And this is actually something I've spoke with Cliff in previously, because if co-ops aren't taught at business school, you don't have the systems around it. You don't have the cooperative accountants or the cooperative lawyers to support the cooperative infrastructure. The Labour government has promised to over as part of its manifesto pledge.
Right. Well, I'd like to thank David for that question, because I'm a great fan. I don't know if any of you have read Carl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. Originally a socialist. Yeah, it was. Anyway, he grew up and worked in Vienna in the 1930s, and was for his views, and he ended up in England, and he ended up going to the Workers' Educational Association and teaching at the Workers' Educational Association. And I have been haranguing trade union leaders for now to say, why on earth don't we invest and reinvent the workers' education system? And he taught history, he taught economics, he taught politics, and it's where he began his work on his great book, The Great Transformation. And think about it, now that would be bottom-up education. I mean, I work quite closely with the TUC, and in particular with their senior economist, Jeff Tiley. But I see the TUC playing a role they could play, which is to bring all the unions together and set up a workers' educational association. Now, of course, there's going to be politics in that. There's going to be money and all of that sort of thing. But ordinary people need to be educated, and the system isn't educating them, and they need to be educated in their own interests. I would say that somehow or other the co-op movement and the unions should be getting together to set up such a thing, such an institution. The unions have the infrastructure. They've got buildings. They train their workers and their staff, and they have conferences where people can go to bone up on certain issues. So why don't we do something more general and bring in, and quite a lot of the academics that would come in and teach voluntarily would be happy to share some of their knowledge a wider audience, so for me, that education, that understanding, and I know from my own experience that education and understanding brings change. People can't, I have to just repeat a story I tell incessantly of the Jubilee 2000 campaign. We began to get people, we would brief people on the complexities of the international financial system and how creditor-debtor relationships worked or didn't work, or how unbalanced they were in favor of the creditor. And we briefed them on the kind of debt relief that the creditor were offering. And as a result of that, we got people to write letters to the Treasury. And one day a Treasury official came up to me and said, "What the hell is going on here?" He said, "We're overwhelmed. We've had to employ extra staff. Gordon Brown's asked for to deal with all these emails, which are demanding answers from us on our strategies at the Paris Club and so on." He said, "But I get letters on pink pieces of paper with little bunches of roses in the corner. And it starts, 'Dear Sir, we understand that in your negotiations with Uganda, you chose as cut-off point for calculating Uganda's outstanding as 1981. Now, can I assure you that blah, blah, blah." He said, "Who taught her about the cut-off date for Uganda's debt?" And I said, "We did. It's not rocket science, We can see what you're doing. You're looking at someone's debt and you're cutting the date on which you give them relief, which means you cut off most of the debt and you leave the rest of it on the books and keep collecting the interest on it. So you can't fool us, and we're not fooling her." But they were astounded that there was, because of course the language used is deliberately arcane, is deliberately designed to bluff you and understand. And we just turned it into ordinary language and said, "Look, let's explain to you what the government's doing here." And then she'd sit at her kitchen table and write her letter on her pink paper with roses in the corner, and then the Chancellor would write back to her, and then she would tell us, and she'd be immensely empowered by that process. So it taught me much about how education empowers people and brings change.
Alex Bird in the chat says the GFTU Education Trust does do some work in this area, but it's small scale at present. And David comments that actually, sadly, what was the WEA in Wales is now part of the further education establishment and is with a total vocational SSS, which is a priority of Welsh Government. And Cliff asks, actually, shouldn't cooperative education be included in mainstream curriculum? And that actually adds any kind of financial education. I remember when I was going through school, we had a very small bit about how to pay your taxes, and it was one lesson in many years of education. So how can we overhaul the education system to make it more relevant in today's landscape?
Dear, just give me all these big questions.
I know, with only 10 minutes to go, I know. Let's fix the world.
So I think, basically we have to make the demand. We have to ask demand, really. And I think there is growing awareness that people need financial. We see what all these are doing. Paul Lewis and I forgot the name of the other chap who runs the ITV show. People are desperate to understand, and they can understand if someone explains it to them. But we need it. So we need to. The Tories have done immense damage to the education system, and I really think that that has to be transformed. We've got to make sure the Labour government does that. Excuse me.
So Chris asks, your views on the first Labour co-op budget in October? And another question actually is around universal basic income. Chris again actually says, if you support universal basic services, which you spoke about earlier, do you call for universal basic income?
Just on that question, we do say that there should kind of basic income for people under universal basic services, but I don't like, and I work with the economist Guy Standing, who is the big promoter of UBI on the Progressive Economy Forum. And I love him dearly, but on this point, he and I are at loggerheads, major loggerheads, actually. Because first of all, I think it'll be very expensive. And secondly, it's very individualistic. I give you some money so you can do what you want to do. Whereas what I would like to see is that money used collectively to provide universal basic services. And so I think these two things are opposed. Although we've come to admit that, yes, a fair amount of basic income has to be provided. It would be incredibly expensive. And the key thing is the way in which the economy works. We have to understand that fundamentally, which is that when people are employment, when the government can mobilize finance pretty much as you can when you apply for a mortgage, if you're a sound citizen and you have some collateral. The government can mobilize enormous quantities of finance. It can use that to invest in employment, in what I would consider as constructive employment. How are we going to retrofit every house, every leaky Victorian household in Britain? And once the government decides it's going to do that, it can then employ people to do that. Those people work, they do the building, the plastering or whatever it is, the engineering, the other needed. They earn income for that, and that income generates income for themselves, but it also generates tax revenues for the state, which can go back to pay for the finance originally raised. And I guess how the system works. So if you take people out of work and you pay them an income, a big income, which wouldn't be taxed, where does the money come from? Do you know what I mean? So it seems to me to be flawed at that economic level on the one hand. On the other hand, it's incredibly individualistic, and I want to see collective. I'm a socialist. I want to see collective solutions.
Ties in really well to another question that Chris posed further up the chat. He said, actually, do we have the wrong economy? I.e., capitalism is driven by produces things that we don't need, but using up carbon. Should we have a services or needs-based economy?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the fundamental in my book about the Green New Deal, I argue that we should be satisfying people's needs, not their wants. And capitalism generates wants in order to satisfy those wants, but it doesn't consider needs as important. And needs include security, a sense of security. It includes health. It includes education. It includes, the right to reproductive health. There are all kinds of fundamental human needs that we cannot manage without, that don't get addressed by capitalism. So yes, we do have to change. We have to either change capitalism or abolish capitalism.
Alex in the chat says, in 1964, the Liberal Party policy was to create an integrated tax and benefit system. One form to fill in would result in either benefits or a tax demand as appropriate. This is not a new idea, but it faded away.
Sounds a good one to me.
It does.
Yeah.
Right, we have 5 minutes left. So actually, let's bring it back to the original question, the environment, policy, power. Because Martin Meatyard earlier on in the chat posed a very important question, is how much time do we actually have left to address these issues, given the rate at which climate breakdown is proceeding? And he shared a link to a TED talk by Johan Rockström. Does the cooperative movement need to act a greater sense of urgency? And I guess it's not just the co-op movement, but the world.
Absolutely. And who was that? Who posed that question?
It was Martin Meatyard. Martin.
Oh, Martin. Yeah, I'm very glad Martin did that, because the Rockström is really important, and what he said very recently, I think, is terrifying. So he's argued that the Amazon already is no longer a carbon sink. It's no longer absorbing carbon. It is now emitting carbon. It's now a source of heat, not a solution to that heat. I mean, that's terrifying. It's tipped over into being a source. And then he said something that was even more frightening, which is that the temperature of the seas, of the oceans, is so high that it too has been a carbon sink and may now be on the point of tipping over and becoming a source of heat. Can you imagine boiling seas? This is what we're thinking of. And I mean, the day before he said that, this Bayesian yacht sank. And so it was so right at the top of my mind, really, that this was a boiling sea, that these one to raise the temperature of, and they were being killed by it, really. This is carbon divide that exists between those who generate the most emissions and those who are the victims of it. But so no, I don't think we have to. I think what's shocking is how relaxed and complacent. So I'm in Suffolk. We have a very shallow coastal shelf. The wind farm investors love it to bits. So we've got German and Danish and every kind of, except British, wind farms off the coast of Suffolk. And they're now building the infrastructure for that energy on land and distributing it through the national grid. Now that's going to take 10, 12 years. And in the meantime, they're ripping up what is a beautiful bit of countryside with a lot of wildlife, really, or diminishing wildlife, nevertheless some of it there. And I mean, the idea of industrializing and this land, when it actually could go offshore and probably could go under the sea, and even that would be damaging. It's just, so there's uproar here in Suffolk over that. But what gives me, but when I see what policymakers are, well, 12 years, we've got 12 years, we could fix this in 12 years. I don't have the sense for 12 years. If I'd be sitting on a yacht in the Mediterranean, I'd be very nervous right now, really, because it's already impacting. And I think there's extraordinary complacency in the government and amongst our technocrats at the international level, and we're all absorbed by the dramas of Donald Trump and the dramas of Putin, and we're all going to war because, that would be the best way to solve things, wouldn't it? And we're all absorbed in Palestine. And this thing is just allowed to fall off the agenda when actually it's the biggest. I used to work for Margaret Beckett back in the day. It seems a long time ago. But I remember her going to the United Nations and saying, this is a security issue. This is not a question of the climate alone. It's a question of the security. If we were being invaded by the Russians, our government would be mobilizing. And indeed, our government is mobilizing in case the Russians invade. But when it comes to climate, we seem to have 12 years, right? So I feel, that's for me is, and, from the bottom up, we have to erupt and we have to say it's not good enough. And we're scared. I'm scared for my children and my grandchildren. I'm terrified for my grandchildren.
It's an absolutely terrifying time. I completely agree. And I think because of this, there is a lot of climate anxiety, especially among young people.
Young people. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I find it quite difficult to sleep at night if I allow myself to think about it too much. But let's not end this beautiful Saturday and this fantastic conversation on a negative point. Can you give us something positive, Anne? Something positive that you've seen or witnessed that's come out of the Green New Deal or that gives you hope?
Well, I tell you, first of all, what's happening in the United States now is positive. I'm so excited about Kamala Harris. I don't think that she's half as radical as she should be, but she's transformed the debate. I think there's still a chance that Donald Trump could be defeated, and if he were defeated, that would be amazing. And the basis on which she's doing it, which is joy, positivity, let's go forward, not back, these are all very exciting. And I have all the reservations that everybody has about Palestine and so on. But nevertheless, I found that very hopeful. The other hopeful thing is that yesterday Brazil banned dear old X completely. And Elon Musk got dumped. I mean, God, when governments can act, they can be so powerful. And why not? Absolutely. So and I feel strongly, as you know, I was born in South Africa. I'm a white South African. My family would never go near Pretoria. It was the most reactionary place in the world because all the nationalists were there. That's where Elon Musk grew up. That's where he learned his racism, and his apartheid and his And now he's being put down by a Brazilian government, right? And they arrested the bad guy who's doing the Telegraph. So I am hopeful. And it's taken far too long. Elon Musk has got away with so much already. But nevertheless, there is hope. And so I'm teared up. I'm very teared up this morning about the Elon Musk story. By the way, I've come off Twitter. And I'm on Blue Sky, and it's such a relief just to be amongst civilized people, really. And so you see, there's good out there.
There is good. And there's some, after I asked that question, there's positive outcomes in the chat as well, actually. So Cliff has said Wales got some groundbreaking legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And this should be celebrated. And Martin says that for some cooperative inspiration about grassroots action, see cooperationhull.co.uk. And of course at Co-op News we do celebrate the activities of co-ops as well. Do check us out too. And Oxfam are campaigning permanently on climate justice, so it says Chris. So there's some excellent, I'm glad we could end on a positive note. And thank you so much for your time this morning. Hugely appreciative. And of course, thanks to Co-op Wales for organising this event. And thanks to everyone who came along to ask some really wide-ranging and deep questions. It's hugely appreciated, giving up your lovely Saturday morning. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. And don't forget to check out the Cooperative Wales YouTube channel. If you search for Co-ops and Mutuals Wales, it should come up. And this video will be edited and put online. And there's lots of other brilliant content there for you to explore as well.
And I would like, if I can, to thank David Smith for his patience. Because but he's been so patient and understanding, and I'd like to thank him for that.
No, it's been wonderful, Anne, and thank you very much on behalf of everyone. It's been really lovely listening to you.
Really.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.